So some years ago now, I took my oldest daughter on a backpacking trip up into the mountains on Guanella Pass. And so we hiked in. We were about 3.5 miles down this trail, and we came to this old cabin. Have you ever been back way into the mountains and you come to those old mining cabins and all those have you seen this, right? So we come to this old cabin, and all that's left of it is about 3 or 4 different logs on each side. And so we start walking in it and around it, and my daughter looks at me like, Daddy, why is this here? I'm like, I don't know, let's explore. And so we start to explore around the area, and we see some cans, and we see some mining equipment, and we see some tools that were left and everything. And so my best guess that I told her, I was like, okay, so here's my guess. My guess is that somebody came up a long time ago, like 100 years ago, early 1900s, and they were up here to mine for gold, right? So they came up here to mine gold, but it didn't go so well. Here's how I figured it out. Later that day, we come back down the trail a little, and we come to this big meadow. And it's only a few hundred yards away from this cabin and this little mining outfit from long ago. And we come to this meadow, and we set up our tent, and after we eat dinner for the night, we kind of start checking out the meadow. And in the middle of this meadow is this big pile of rocks, but not like an accidental pile of rocks, but like, humans put it there a really long time ago. And it's in this perfect shape of a rectangle. So I'm not going to tell like a 4-year-old this, but it was an unmarked grave, right? And so I start to think like, oh, I'm going to bed. I'm like, oh, baby, those are just rocks, right? But it's like this unmarked grave. And so as I fall to sleep, I'm like, wow, my mind starts to churn because my brain is like a hamster wheel all the time, right? And so my mind starts to turn. I'm like, I start thinking about this person. Like, who were they? Why were they here? Okay, what was their life? So they come up to the mountains to get rich, to get famous, to strike it rich, right? And then what happens? They die, and they're just buried in this unmarked grave. And then my mind goes to the next step of like, does anyone even know they were up here? Does anyone know their name? Does anyone even know they existed? And the answer is no. Their grave isn't even marked. Like this is a person, this was a human with a real life and real feelings and real experiences who is just forever forgotten. They had this dream of being great, right? Striking it rich, being wealthy, and now they're forgotten. None of us want to be forgotten, right? We all want to be remembered. We all want to be great. Raise your hand if you hope that everybody forgets about you like 2 minutes after you die. Nobody? Okay, maybe we need to talk later. That's okay. None of us want to be forgotten. We all want to be remembered. We all want to be great. But the question is like, what makes a person great? What makes someone worthy of being remembered? What makes someone worthy of being great? Well, the world will tell you that there's a certain path to greatness. It kind of goes through fame, it goes through fortune, it goes through power, it goes through having your name remembered for certain reasons. It's like that person who went to the top of that mountain and gave their life to try to take gold out of the earth so that they would be great in the world and their bank account would be big and they would have all the gold and the fame and the power, right? That's greatness in the world, but Jesus proposes a very different idea of being great. And while many of us will get tricked by the world in pursuing greatness through fame or wealth or power or wanting accolades and promotions, and we think that will make us great, we will end up forgotten. But if you pursue the way that Jesus says to be great, you will be remembered for eternity. You might be forgotten by the world. Your name might be forgotten by the world. You could even be placed into an unmarked grave, and yet your name and your greatness will go down in the kingdom of God for eternity if you pursue greatness in the way that Jesus says to. So today we're going to look at this story from Mark 10 that contrasts these two very different ways to pursue greatness in the world. The two different ways to pursue greatness in your life, the way of the world or the way of Jesus, the kingdom of the world or the kingdom of Jesus. Do you want to be great? Because it all boils down to whether you participate in this spiritual discipline that Jesus is going to talk about in Mark chapter 10. So let's get back into this passage. It starts in verse 35. It says this, Mark 10:35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, so two of Jesus' disciples, came to Jesus. So here's where we're at in the story. We're progressing pretty far into the Gospels. And so it's been a few years since Jesus gathered the first of his 12 disciples. So he's gathered these guys, and now he has spent almost 3 years traveling through the countryside, teaching and doing miracles, and then following alongside him. And so a lot of times we think about, oh, that'd be awesome to be with Jesus for like 3 years, and it totally would. But guess what? You got to be with the other 11 dudes too, right? And so like these 12 disciples, they're traveling with each other every day. They're walking, they're hiking with each other, they're eating with each other, they're staying in the same hotels, they're staying in the same guest houses. Have you ever been with even like a close friend for 2 weeks? You know what I'm talking about? Like even someone you're like, you're awesome, I love you. By the end of it, you're like, you know what? It's not me, it's you, and we need a little break, right? Like even your best friends, you will get annoyed if can you imagine spending 3 years with the same group, 12 guys? You're gonna start getting into arguments, you just are. You're gonna start getting into arguments like this. Luke 9:46, it's a similar story. An argument arose among the disciples, as to which of them was the greatest. This is the argument, right? Who is the greatest? Now you have to understand the irony of this argument. Because Jesus went out, when he chose his disciples, he didn't go out and pick the CEO. He didn't go out and pick the professor. He didn't go out and pick the cream of the crop. He went and picked people specifically who were not great. He picked super average to below average people so he would get the greatness. And then you have these guys being like, well, I'm the greatest. That's like a group of guys who flunk out of Algebra 1, and so they're in summer school, and they spend all of Algebra 1 summer school being like, well, I'm the best at algebra, actually. Nobody knows that, but I'm the best. No, you're not. You're totally missing the point. And these guys were totally missing the point. They're not the greatest. That's why he picked them. So once again, these few disciples are coming to Jesus for Jesus to officiate an argument, as if he's like the teacher on the playground. And James and John say this, "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." The courage on those guys, right? That is a question. When you were a kid, did you ever go to your parents and you know this scene, right? You run into your house and you're like out of breath, you're like, "Mom, okay, I gotta tell you something. You gotta promise not to be mad, okay?" Your mom's like, "What did you do?" Right? Just promise not to be mad, Mom. That's what James and John are like, just Jesus, before we even tell you what's up, just promise to do what we're gonna tell you to do. Nothing good comes after that. Nothing good ever comes after that. Here's what happens, verse 36. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." So what James and John are asking is for Jesus to make them the greatest. Now, they're thinking that Jesus, because remember, he hasn't died and been resurrected yet. He's still going around teaching, and he's still being proclaimed as the Messiah. And a lot of people in his society believed at that time that the Messiah, they mistakenly began to believe that the Messiah was going to come as a political and military figure to destroy Rome and rule as king over Israel, like as a earthly, normal king. And so James and John haven't quite got the message that this kingdom is going to be really different. And so they're thinking that he's going to be a normal sort of king. And a normal sort of king, he doesn't do everything, right? He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. He doesn't want to work 40 hours a week. So what does he do? He has like a guy on his left and right hand that do all the stuff for him. These really powerful people that actually have the power, and these are the great people in the kingdom that really run things for him. So in the throne room, these two dudes would sit on his right and left, and they help him rule. And James and John would be like, "Oh, the only greatness we can think of is we want to be those guys. Like, we want to be the guys who are in charge for you. Like, when you become king of Israel, when you do all that stuff, we want to be in charge. We want to run things. We want the power. We want to be great. We want to be remembered." Not so fast. Verse 38. "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" He's talking about his death. Jesus is talking about the sacrifice he's going to make for you and for me. They don't get it, though. Verse 39. "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those whom they have been prepared." Jesus is saying in a metaphorical way, you've got no idea what you're talking about, guys. No idea. You don't know the suffering I'm about to go through. And they're like, "Oh yeah, we can." He's like, "Don't argue with me, I'm Jesus," right? Don't argue with me. What are you doing? And the funny thing is he says, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the." He's saying, James and John, someday you are going to die for me just as I'm going to die for you. And historically we know that that's what ended up happening. They both gave their life for Jesus. But they're not understanding in this moment, because Jesus hasn't died and been resurrected. They're not understanding what it is to be on his right and left. They're not understanding what kind of king and what kind of kingdom this is. And so James and John actually think that they can really do this. Verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, so the 10 other disciples, right? When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John, because had you asked the 12 disciples, like, who's the greatest disciple, you would have gotten 12 different answers. They all thought that they were the greatest disciple. Like, even Bartholomew thought he was the greatest disciple. He had to know we were going to forget about that guy. That is a name, right? Nobody remembers Bartholomew. We have forgotten about most of the... So this is the first half of our story. James and John, they want to be great, but they're going by this really worldly definition of great, where they want the power, they want the prestige, they want the promotion, they want the money, they want that worldly greatness. Because that's how the world tells us to strive for greatness. And James and John bought into this definition of greatness. That to be great, to be remembered, to be great is to be wealthy and powerful. It is to get all the accolades. It is to be rich. It is to be over other people, because the world says selfish self-promoters are great. That's what the world says. And this is exactly what James and John are assuming. I mean, this is the ultimate moment of self-promotion, right? They literally are coming to Jesus to get a promotion for themselves. They're selfish. They want to sit at his right and left hand because the world says selfish self-promoters are great. Think about how the world defines and measures greatness. The world often measures greatness by how many followers you've got, how many clicks, how big's your bank account, how many promotions have you had, how many awards have you gotten, how many people know your name? And this is what we all buy into, this idea of greatness. It's why studies have told us that teenagers, 54%, most of teenagers now want the career of being a celebrity when they grow up. That's being great, right? It's all about the fame. Isn't that being great? It's all about the power. It's all about the wealth. Isn't that being great? The world says selfish self-promoters are great. But is that definition right? Is that way of pursuing greatness the way to joy and peace? Is it the way to even being remembered? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Is power the path to greatness? Many of the most powerful people in our country are CEOs, right? University of Cincinnati did a study and found that CEOs suffer from depression at twice the rate of the normal population. That's not the path. Is money the path to greatness? Doesn't seem like it. Studies have shown that any raise in income for a household over about $75,000 a year does not increase the family's happiness. Is fame the path to greatness? Doesn't seem like it. The University of Sydney study found that among different sorts of careers that lead to fame, like musician and actor, that on average, they pass 25 years before the general population. They have 25 years less lifespan. The world says selfish self-promoters are great, but it isn't that great, is it? None of that sounds great. It's not working. The world's definition of greatness isn't great. In fact, the world's path to greatness is often the path to being forgotten. So, that's a good-looking guy, right? It's a beautiful man. This beautiful man was in the United States' first multimillionaire. super, in his day, this was like the Bill Gates of his day, right? He was the United States' first multimillionaire. He monopolized the fur trade in the United States, one of the biggest industries in the Americas a few hundred years ago. So he monopolized it, super rich. I've never quite gotten the whole beaver skin hat thing. I've never thought that that's a great fashion trend. I'm sorry if you're wearing one today, but I've never got it. But he had a corner on the market. So he becomes the richest guy in the country. Everybody knows his name. Everybody knows who he is. He's super powerful. He's involved in international, all sorts of merchant ships and everything. He's power, all the power, the money, the fame you ever want. So of course you remember him, right? Do you guys don't know who this is? This is the very famous and good-looking John Jacob Astor. By the world standard in his day, this was the greatest human in our country in his day. And you've got no idea who he is. For all you know, I could have made this up. And this could be a picture of some random guy, right? It's not, but that's how irrelevant and unremembered he is. The world says selfish self-promoters are great. But the world's definition of great isn't that great. In fact, the world's path to greatness is often the path to being miserable and forgotten. Okay, back to the story. James and John have now asked Jesus. They've come to him like, oh, we want to be great in your kingdom. We want to sit on your right and left hand. And it seems like all the disciples, like us, want to be great because they all chime in like, no, I'm actually the greatest Jesus. I'm actually the greatest Jesus. So verse 42, Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. So what Jesus is specifically talking about is, you see, in his day in Israel, the Roman Empire actually owned Israel. Like, they were actually in charge. So had you walked through the streets of Jerusalem, you would have run into Roman soldiers, and those dudes were in charge. And they had a hierarchy, and they ruled through power and violence and wealth that the world had never seen. And so the way they led, the way they became great, was through power and wealth and accumulation of riches and violence and might. And Jesus says, nope, not with you guys. If you guys are going to get this, you guys don't get this right now. If you're going to get this, if you're going to be a part of my kingdom, you got to understand being great looks different. Jesus' followers have a very different way of being great. Here it is, verse 43. Instead, this is Jesus speaking, instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. To Jesus, the path to greatness goes through being a servant. Meaning, if you want to be great, you should consume your life with serving the needs of others and serving the needs of the mission of Jesus. Slave in his society was the lowest rung of the societal power structure. And so he's saying, if you want to be great, if you want to be high, you've got to be low. He's saying, I'm going to flip this whole way of being great upside down. Jesus says selfless servants are great. He put it in a very similar way in Matthew 23, 11-12, where he said, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Selfless servants are great. That's who is great in Jesus' kingdom. It's not the person with all the power and all the wealth and all the might who can boss everybody around. It's the person who serves and who's humble and below others. For Jesus, being great means being a humble servant. No self-promotion, no celebrity involved. This is an upside-down sort of definition from the world. This is an upside-down sort of kingdom that Jesus is proposing that we are a part of. And so great people in the kingdom of Jesus are radically others-centered instead of self-centered. Great people are radically Jesus promoters instead of self-promoters. Great people are radically contributing instead of consuming. Jesus says selfless servants are great. And then our whole story, it ends with this verse in verse 45. For even the Son of Man, which is usually the term which Jesus used to refer to himself, God who became man. Even the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, meaning Jesus came to serve us. Now, the spiritual disciplines are the habits that we take on in our lives. I think I hit that. I'm sorry, Jeremy. Spiritual disciplines are the habits that we take on in our lives that help us to become more like Jesus. And so the spiritual disciplines are the things that if we look in Scripture in the Gospels and we see Jesus doing, we see like we're his habits, right? Praying, reading Scripture, serving others, creating community. And we say, I want to take on the habits of Jesus to become more like Jesus. That's what the spiritual disciplines are. And if Jesus is saying, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, that tells us that one of the habits that we need to take on in our lives is to serve. Because if Jesus did it, and it was his habit and his discipline, that it needs to be a spiritual discipline of ours. He gave his life on the cross so we can be redeemed to God if we believe in him. That was serving us, and so we need to serve others. Jesus' point to his disciples was so simple. You got to follow my example, even if it costs you. And you gotta go serve other people. That's how you become great. That's how you become great. So, you didn't recognize John Jacob Astor, but do you recognize this person? Right? Everybody does, right? This is Mother Teresa. I bet you know that, right? She was the Albanian nun who was born in 1910. She moved to India as a 19-year-old. She began to serve as a teacher for years, and then one day she decides to take this trip by train across India, and she's seeing all this grinding poverty in the country of India, and she felt that Jesus was calling her to serve the poorest people in the world. And so she begins to just set up organizations and orders, and she begins to just give her whole life to serve the most impoverished people you can imagine, until she ultimately passed after decades of serving others in 1997. So while you have no idea who John Jacob Astor is, the richest, most famous, powerful person in his day, you all know who she is. So what's the real path to greatness? If you don't want to be forgotten, if you want to be remembered, what's the real path to greatness? Maybe Jesus is right. Selfless servants are great. Which begs the question of who are you serving and where are you serving? If you want to be truly great, if you want to really be remembered, then go serve other people and do it as humbly as you can. Because Jesus says selfless servants are great. But here's the thing. Serving others is a discipline. One of the most deep-seated sins we all have is selfishness, right? Which keeps us away from serving. And so it's a discipline to come out of that sin and actually be living in this life of serving others. And so there's a discipline, there's a habit to it. I don't naturally want to serve others more than myself. It's something I have to do, something I have to train myself into. And so I think there's at least 3 steps in this spiritual discipline of being a person who becomes a servant, of taking on this spiritual discipline, this spiritual habit of Jesus to go and serve others. So first, you got to look for needs. You got to look around you and go, okay, where are needs? Where are actually needs that I could serve in? What's needed? What's needed in my church? What's needed in my neighborhood? What's needed in the lives of my friends? You got to look for the needs. Now, one of the mantras of our culture right now is change the world. Right? We all think we're going to change the world. And the brutal truth is, you can't, right? Like most of us just don't have the position to go stop a war. I can't, right? Most of us don't have the power and the wealth to go stop a famine. Most of us are not going to be able to change world events. And so when you hear this mantra of like, oh, change the world, what it often does is it freezes you from doing anything. And then you don't serve anyone and you don't make any change because you thought that they told you it only counts if you change the world. So what we need to do is we need to ask, like, actually right around you, in the places where you can make a difference, where are their needs? Where are their needs in your own community? And right now, even next Saturday, we're talking about, hey, our church has adopted this one apartment complex where it's a lot of families, barely putting food on the table, right? Because even our church collectively, man, we can't even change our whole city right now, but we can absolutely change the lives of like 100 families, right? And so we've been like, okay, there's the need there, right? Or maybe there's one family on your street. They're like, oh, there's needs. There's a need there. Or there's a friend going through something that you have. Or a family member. Actually identify needs around you. Don't get obsessed with the news. You're not going to change that. Get obsessed with the people right around you, the neighborhood, the city, the friends, the family around you. Where are the needs? And then secondly, ask what needs you can fill, right? Ask what needs you can fill. What are you really good at? How are you gifted? And then how does that fit some of the needs that you've seen right around you, right? So if you're awesome with kids, in our church we have like 1 million kids somehow. They outnumber us like 30-1. I don't know how. It's a huge need, right? Maybe you could help there. Or you've got a neighbor that's older and you can go over and shovel their driveway when it snows like 2 feet on a Thursday for some reason, right? You can serve them. Or there's some friends, and some of their needs of your friends are like stuff at work that you really can't do about, but maybe they got a need at home you can. Like what's the stuff God uniquely gifted you for, and you can step into a role in someone's life and actually fill it. Not the stuff that you're not gifted for, not the stuff you can do nothing about, but like what's the stuff you actually can do something about, that God has uniquely gifted you to fill. And then do something, right? That would be step 3. Don't just think about it. Don't just turn it over your brain over and over again. Don't just daydream about what you might do. Do it. Act. Serve. Serve others. Get out there. You won't magically wake up tomorrow serving others. You have to serve as a discipline. You have to take on this habit in your life of identifying the needs, knowing how you can fill them, and then actually doing something. Being great is as simple as serving, and it is a spiritual discipline. It's something that you can put into your life. Not a lot of us will end up being millionaires. Not a lot of us will end up being powerful politicians. But you know what? That's the way that the world measures greatness. You can be great by being humble and simply serving the people around you, serving in your church, serving your neighborhood, serving in your family, serving in your friends. For me, there's these people that I grew up with that, man, I look at and they were so great. They were so great. So I grew up in the same church from about the time I was 6 to about the time I was 18, right? And so it was a super old school church, like organ and all that stuff. And we had kids' church before you had big church. And so at kids' church, I had the same 4 volunteers for like 5 years. Like the whole time I was coming through kids' church. It was awesome, right? And it was two couples were in it. It was Elaine and Jim McClanahan, and it was Cindy and Pete Rhodes. And they would serve every Sunday. I don't think they almost never missed a Sunday, right? And they were just the most humble people. But to me, they were awesome. They were awesome. I still remember all these stories of just seeing them try to serve us and be kind to us. We totally didn't deserve it. Me and my friends in church were wild. Like, our kids are great. I don't know what we were up to when we were kids, right? It might be because this church, for some reason, we have a bunch of girls, and my church had a bunch of boys. I don't know. But I still remember times like Elaine making us give her the gum in our mouth because we were on our 17th piece of the morning and we were just destroying all of the church's carpet, and her being patient about that for some reason, which I totally wouldn't be. She was just the sweetest person in the world. Or Cindy, her trying to give us the best row, even though we definitely weren't, just to, encourage us. Or Jim McClanahan getting up and teaching and just having to get louder and louder as he tried to explain the flannel graph because we were making fun of the little figures on it, right? Like they just served. No matter how difficult we were ornery, man. And they just every week they came, they served. And they came, they served. And in my eyes, they were awesome, right? They were great. They were great. And they had such a big impact on me, just laying like a foundation of faith based on scripture and just teaching these stories. I still remember the flannel graph with them teaching Jesus walking on the water. I still remember this stuff, right? And this is 3 decades ago. No, I'm sorry, this is 5 years ago because I'm 20. I forgot about that. So last year I'm back home at the church I grew up in Kansas, and it was for a funeral. So I'm in the really long line for Jell-O salad and all that you get in Kansas Baptist churches. And I'm in the back line. I spot them. They're all standing together in the middle of the line. So I get out of the line, I go up, and I give them a big hug, and I just be like, oh, thank you. Thank you so much for serving. Thank you. And just, tell them how much they meant to me and how much I just care about them and just all the memories I have of them. And I've kind of tried to keep up with them through the years. I mean, when we decided to plant this church like 7 years ago, they were some of the very first people I called day one. Because they had served me as I was a child decades before. And now I look at, they're at that age where they're retiring, and they're just humble people. Humble people. You're talking like a guy who worked with flowers and plants, a guy who was an electrician, a dental hygienist, stay-at-home mom. But to me, they were the greatest. Oh my goodness, they were the greatest. I wouldn't know where my faith would be today without them. And it's just because they served. By any standard of the world, they weren't that great. But by the standard of the kingdom, they're so great. They're so great simply because they served. The world will tell you, the world will say selfish self-promoters are great. But Jesus says selfless servants are great. So the question is, where are you serving? Our culture will say, hey, change the world. But hey, you want to change your family? Serve your family. You want to change your church? Serve in your church. Do you want to change where you work? Serve your coworkers. You want to change your marriage? Serve your spouse. Serve. That's the way to greatness. Who will be talking about your greatness in 30 years? Because you were serving in the most humble, consistent, lowly way today. Being great is as simple as serving. So who are you serving?